FM. Kaieteur Radio.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this week's episode of Governance, Corruption, and Justice. I'm your hostess, editor at Kaieteur News, Kiana Wilberg, and tonight we will be focusing on the petroleum sector. To provide us with some perspectives on crucial topics related to this sector is Mr. Floyd Haynes. For those of you who may not be aware of who this Guyanese-born son of the soil is, he's a professional with over 30 years of executive-level experience. He's a certified public accountant and a certified fraud examiner who holds a master's degree in public policy from Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. Mr. Haynes is also an adjunct professor in finance and accounting at the University of the District of Columbia. He's also a public lecturer in leadership and management. Mr. Haynes is also the founder and president of Haynes Incorporated, a Washington-based accounting firm. Mr. Haynes, thank you for joining us this evening and welcome to Kaieteur Radio.
Thank you, Kiana. It's my pleasure. Happy to be here.
Great. So I know that we were scheduled to start at 7:20, and we do apologize for the late start, but Mr. Haynes was caught up in a very heated discussion before he entered the studios with the publisher of Kaieteur News. Many of you who've been following his very interesting show on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, you know exactly how Mr. Lau feels about the oil sector. And tonight we're going to get into some topics that are very important to many Guyanese. Mr. Haynes, I'd like to start off with the loopholes in the Stabroek Block deal. I know that paying attention to what's going on in Guyana, the conversation, the debate on many of these topics, you would have heard that many Guyanese are concerned about some of the loopholes in the Stabroek Block deal. And I'd like to start off first with your impression of the agreement and if you believe Guyana got shafted.
Well, as I say, I've looked at the overall agreement, the production sharing agreement. And as I share most people's opinion that on its surface, it appears as if Guyana got a raw deal. Now, sometimes one of the challenges we have is what is known as information asymmetry. Asymmetrical information, meaning that you're getting one side of the coin but not the other. Oftentimes, to make a proper decision or a proper analysis, you need to look at it from both sides. All and sundry believes that the current PSA in its form is disadvantageous to Guyana. People have called it worse. I tend to think it's a bad deal for Guyana. The question is, what do we do about it? The deal was signed 5 years ago under a previous administration. We now have a new administration in place, and they have to think through what are some of the approaches. Now, there are several things you can do when you have a bad deal. You can negotiate some of the shortfalls of this deal in a future deal, meaning you go to the operator and you say, listen, we realize we got a bad deal. We'd like to make it up. The people are demanding it. We're a new administration. We think we would like to go forward with a good relationship, but here are some changes we'd like to recommend. And that's one way to approach it. You have to also understand that when you take a position of renegotiating a contract, there are trade-offs. Everything in life is a trade-off. And so the question for the government is what are the trade-offs of renegotiating an existing contract? And some of the things that come to mind as I see it is you have to be careful that you don't send the message to the world that Guyana is not a country that can keep its word. We negotiated in good faith. This is what the operator would say. With one government, a new government comes in, and they've reneged on the agreement. The contract is a legally binding document. So that's the trade-off. Now, having said that, it doesn't mean that you should settle for less and you should not negotiate it. What I think the leaders have to do is to be able, and I've suggested this, is to sit in a room with the folks from Exxon and go through some of some of the issues that the government has, and try to reach some kind of agreement. There will be some give and take on both sides. But this is how these things are done. It's not litigated in the press. These aren't things that you can just stand up off to the side and say, we have a bad deal, why aren't you guys going in and fixing it? It's just not how it's done. So I'm all in favor of renegotiating the deal, but I'm in favor of doing it strategically. And I think the government of the day should consider that. I don't know if they're doing it, but I suspect they probably are. Sometimes we are not privy to everything that's going on, but it doesn't mean nothing is going on. Everybody in Guyana believes that this is a bad deal, and I think the government is listening.
What gives you the impression that the government is listening?
Well, I could say that I know some of the players personally, but of course that doesn't help. I'm on the outside looking in, and I think they have Guyana's best interest at heart. I really do believe that. And I also think, and I've been in conversations where the idea of fixing the bad deal going forward has been talked about by people in the government. So I know it has been considered. There has been some belief that, listen, we cannot go in and rock the boat on this current deal, but if we could tag the shortfalls here onto something in the future, then that's probably a better approach. And it's those, and I've heard those discussions.
Okay. Thank you very much for that. I'm going to shift some attention to another important element in governing the oil sector, and that has to do with local content. And I'm happy to speak with you on this matter because you were one of the members of the local content panel that was appointed by President Irfan Ali. And with that said, I'd like to speak with you about some of the recommendations that you believe were key coming out of that panel being constituted by the president. And do you believe some of the recommendations are in keeping with the draft that was put out there for consideration?
I think so. I think local content is a serious matter. But it's sort of what I call the local content triangle. It's a three-legged stool, if you may. And on the one side of that, or one leg, is the role of the government. The government's role is to enact legislation.
Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Come up with systems to measure performance. The government should set measurable goals and objectives. In other words, here are some things we'd like to see done. And then they should have ways to measure performance. And then finally, the government should be able to punish. There should be punitive measures for operators or companies that don't comply. That's the government side. Mm-hmm. The second leg of that is the operator. The operator's role is more information dissemination, making people aware of what's available. You know, if you ask the average Guyanese to situate themselves in the context of the oil and gas sector, they wouldn't know. I met a young man yesterday and he says, I want to be in oil and gas. Well, what does that mean? So what I'm saying, and the government also has a partial role in this. You have to be able to lay out the value chain of the industry. Think of it as a big picture. You've got upstream, midstream, downstream. And under each of those streams, there are various industries: fabrication, welding, hospitality, and so on and so forth. You have to lay that picture out so that, and then take the show on the road so that each and every individual have a sense of where they fit. If you're sitting down there as a food supplier, food vendor, or a welder, or a mechanic, electrician, you have to have a sense of where you fit in. So that's the role of the operator. And finally, there's a role for the people. The people's role is to equip themselves with the necessary certifications, the right training, and all of those types of things. And it's those three things working in tandem that will promote, I think, an efficient and effective local content policy. If one side is doing it, it won't work. And of course, all of that has to play against an ecosystem that supports that. If there's training that's necessary, you cannot simply enforce legislation if your people aren't ready. Because what happens? If you're not sufficiently trained, if you don't have the necessary certification, if you don't have the professional development that allows you to comport yourself a certain way in business, then all of that creates inefficiency. If there's inefficiency in the part of Exxon, it increases their cost. If their cost goes up, we pay for it through cost recovery. So we have to strike that balance. And so I think we have to look at that local content triangle and make sure that each side of that triangle is doing its part.
On that note, I'd like to ask you about this issue of a gap analysis. Did the panel make any recommendations for there to be local content targets? And the reason why I'm asking this is because it points to the very statement you said about inefficiencies.
Yeah.
If we don't know basically what the capacity is in country.
Yeah.
So did the panel do any sort of analysis of the capabilities of the country at this point in time for the oil sector? And did you recommend targets based on that?
Oh yes, it was. We looked at everything, and it was felt that Guyana we didn't have the adequate training. In other words, if you look at some of our companies, to do business at an international level, you require certain certifications, ISO 9000, those types of things. Mm-hmm. And there are lots of other certifications. And we understood clearly that a lot of our businesses didn't have those certifications. And so we recommend that our educational institutions work jointly with other certification boards to provide the adequate level of certification. So we did provide that. We did recommend some targets, but they weren't hard targets because we felt that because remember, our role was more advisories to give some recommendations. Mm-hmm. And so we had some broad-based recommendations, and the idea was that once it got into the ministries and they began to work on it, they would come up with finite targets. It's very difficult to come up with targets when you don't have a good sense of the skills level or the skills deficit of your people, both at the company level as well as the individual level. Mm-hmm. But yeah, we did recommend targets. All of those things, that's part of the government side we recommended, that you have measurable goals and objectives. If you don't have measurable goals and objectives, how would you know if they're not performing? And then you have to have a means to measure them. Mm-hmm. Right? You have to implement them. You see, this idea, here's what I think. I think we focus on the wrong thing. Everybody is focusing on the legislative part of local content. Where's the policy? Where's the legislation? Well, that's one part of the three-legged stool. If you don't have an ecosystem that's where each component of that triangle is pulling its weight, you're never going to get an adequate and effective local content. And so the focus has to be, fine, legislation is one part of it, but it doesn't stop there. It has to be enforced. The targets have to be met, they have to be measured, and there should be some sort of punitive measure for folks not meeting their targets. That's the one side. And then the people have got to make sure. You see, sometimes it's easy to shift responsibility, well, it's the government's got to do it. No, we have a responsibility too. And I'll talk a little bit about this when I talk about what leadership really is. Because there is a role for you, the individual, the businesses, to equip yourselves, position yourselves, but you can't do that if you don't understand where you fit in the value chain. And that's where the operator comes in. So it's all of these various components working in tandem that will give us an effective local content agenda. Everybody has to pull his or her weight. It's all hands on deck.
I get that point. So even if we have the legislation in place, if we don't ensure that our people are trained to basically be part of that and make the policy and the legislation be what it is intended to be, then
It'd have no effect.
it has no effect.
That's exactly right.
essentially.
It's not, because you would then have to go to the operators and tell them, hire Guyanese and Guyanese company in spite of. And they will say, well, we need XYZ certification. They don't have it. And what are you going to say? Hire them anyway? But that would be self-defeating. You're shooting yourselves in the foot because they'll create inefficiency, which then redound back to Guyana through cost recovery. So it's all of those pieces working in tandem that will allow for an effective local content. That's why I call it the local content triangle. It's a triangle. It's not just the government. They have a role and they have to do their part, and the people should make sure that the government does its part. But the people also have to do their part.
Understood. Now, this brings me back to another point that I wanted to raise with you with regard to the operators. One of the things that we have not seen since the start of local content is any of the reports, because according to the production sharing agreement that we have with Exxon, local content reports are supposed to be submitted to the government, and we have not seen a single report. Has the panel, did the panel, the local content panel, look at that in terms of recommending that there be some level or greater level of transparency and accountability to the people where these reports are concerned?
Absolutely. That was part of our recommendation. And that's the measuring part, right?
To have the reports published?
To have the reports, yes.
Okay.
To have the report, make the reports available to the government. I don't think, if the company wants to make it available to the public, that's fine. The government can make it available to it should be public information, right? Oil is a national patrimony. It doesn't belong to the government or the operator. It belongs to the people. But that's one of the things we recommended, and that's the measuring part, right? How could you measure performance if you don't have reports? And so as part of measuring whether or not the operators are doing its part, you have to have the reports. It was definitely part of the recommendation, and I think it will come out. It may not because legislation is a different thing. That's more of a legal thing, but there has to be an implementation mechanism, and in that process should be reports, measurable goals, objectives, that type of thing, targets, all of those things should make itself into the implementation process.
So on that note, I want to go to another aspect of local content before I move on to the Sovereign Wealth Fund.
Okay.
Using local content as a tool to claw back value. I wanted to know if you or any other members of the panel that you would have had interactions with, if there was any look at or analysis of policies that were done by other countries. And the reason why I raised this is because at Kaieteur News, we had taken a look at the policy, the local content policy for Ghana.
Yeah.
One of the interesting provisions that we noted is that you can't go into Ghana and try to create a company and benefit from the patrimony of the people without having one of the locals on board.
Absolutely.
As part of the company. So in terms of finding ways and means to claw back value, were those the kind of provisions that the panel looked at? Again,
of course, we had Tony Paul, right, who was a member of the panel, and Tony worked on that Ghana thing. Tony worked all over the world, mostly in Africa, advising them on local content. Mm-hmm. But yeah, that's one of the things, and I would be surprised if it didn't make its way into the legislation. We looked at how do you define what's a Guyanese company or a Guyanese-owned company? Is it a company that's 51% owned by Guyanese? How do you prevent people from gaming that system, where you come into the country and you recruit a Guyanese and make the Guyanese the head, but and where does the profit go and who takes out So there are lots of things that were discussed. Mm-hmm. All of it pointing to the benefit of local content should redound to Guyanese. The profits should stay in Guyana. So we looked at things like that, where, if you have a company that's set up in Guyana, but most of the profit is shipped outside, well, that's not local content. And more importantly, so think of local content as a sliding scale. At one end of the scale is they're doing 90% of the work and we're doing 10%. And at the other end of that scale, it's the reverse. So it's a continuum, right? And we have to start somewhere and make our way along that continuum. And it was Tony's position, and I support it, and most of the members concurred, that we want to get to a point where we're doing most of the work to support oil and gas. And when we say that, we don't just mean secretarial, administrative, and that type of thing. Value-added work. We want to see Guyanese in management positions. But again, we have to be trained, we have to have the capacity. But that's where we thought it should be going, that Guyanese should be doing the majority of the work in oil and gas. So we want to start with that maybe 90-10, 80-20, and then flip it by the time we get 5-10 years down the road, or even sooner. But yes, that was definitely looked at.
Thank you very much. Now, let's look at this matter of the Sovereign Wealth Fund.
The Sovereign Wealth Fund.
Yes. Guyana has a natural resource fund, as you know, and many of our listeners, at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York.
Yes.
And it currently holds over $344 million US. The government has said that it's not touching a cent until it tightens the law. But what's your take on how this money should be managed to avoid corruption and mismanagement?
Well, first, let me say I totally agree with the government's position. Right now, we don't really have a rather good legislation. We're working the Petroleum Commission, and we're working on the legislation that governs the Sovereign Wealth Fund. But let me talk a little bit about Sovereign Wealth Fund. The idea behind a Sovereign Wealth Fund is it's intergenerational. It's based on the idea that the resource belongs to the people, and every generation of Guyanese should benefit from it. So you create a fund, you put the money into a fund, and you save it for future generations. Now that's all well and good, except that Guyana has immediate needs. And so when people talk about the Norwegian model or the Santiago principle and all of these things, those are all well and good, and we should consult them. But we should create our own set of rules and laws so that, as it relates to Guyana when it comes to Sovereign Wealth Fund. And what I mean by that, Guyana has immediate needs. We need improvements in healthcare, education, infrastructure, right? So there are things we have to look at. Again, it's a balancing act. We can't take all of the money and spend it on those things, but we have to be able to use some of that money to help develop the country. If you look at countries like Norway, they were developed when they discovered oil. And so they didn't have some of the immediate and pressing needs. And I heard Vice President Jagdeo made this point, and I agree with him. We have to look at the Sovereign Wealth Fund in terms of Guyana's immediate needs. So that's one thing. But historically, it's meant to be intergenerational. Now, how do I think this should be managed? I think we should have a professional management firm. This is what most countries do. We're not the government is not a money manager. So you can have a professional firm manage the funds. And that means that firm will decide in concert with government representatives what type of funds to invest this money in. So that takes care of the management side. On the administrative side, you need to have strong policies governing withdrawals and deposits into that fund. Who determines what goes into that fund, but more importantly, who determine how and when money comes out? And I think that is something best handled by a group, a panel, a commission of some sort. No single individual should be allowed to make that decision. No single individual. You have to have a commission with checks and balances. And you can be creative. You can have members from the government, civil society, diaspora Guyanese. You may even have non-Guyanese. You have to have a diverse, not just a diverse group of people, but people with diverse interests that could be overseeing the administration of that fund. And then you allow the fund to grow and to build. Most countries don't even touch their sovereign wealth fund because the interest that accrues on those funds are enough for them to use to supplement their annual budgets and those types of things. And that should be the goal of Guyana. We should allow the body of the fund, what they call the corpus, to stay intact. So that 300 million should be 4 all the way to $1 billion. We should invest that billion, and then the proceeds from that investment we should be using for infrastructure, healthcare, and those types of things. And that's how I would go about it.
What would you say to some individuals who believe that given the immediate needs of Guyana right now, we're facing a pandemic which requires money to respond to, and we're facing the worst flood that we've seen in our history? What do you say to the people who believe that perhaps we should access part of that money so that we can properly respond?
Perhaps. And this is where I get in trouble, because I don't like to make decisions without all of the facts. Maybe it's a good idea. I don't know. I'm always erring on the side of caution when it comes to going into that sovereign wealth fund to use it as an emergency slush fund. It's a very, very bad precedent to set. And so my first reaction would be, it's a bad idea. Now, having said that, I don't know the state of the affairs of Guyana. I don't know how much money they have. I don't know what their budget is, those types of things. If I had a chance to look at all of that, I can probably give a better answer. But I don't like the idea of treating the sovereign wealth fund as a slush fund to handle emergency. I think it's a very bad precedent to set. And then bringing that money into the country also has a different set of problems with Dutch disease and those types of things. So I'd be very careful how I recommend that.
Interesting that you mentioned the Dutch disease, because my next question is about that. Guyana has found itself in a position where it has a lot of oil.
Yeah.
But the legislative and the regulatory framework to ensure proper management, efficient management of this, the revenue that's going to come from this resource, it's not in place. And we've seen recommendations for the legislative and the regulatory mechanisms to be put in place from the UNDP, the IMF, the World Bank, the IDB, but none of them have actually been touched. Yeah. So do you believe that if we continue to drag our feet on putting the legislative and the regulatory framework in place, we may find ourselves entrapped by the Dutch disease?
Yes. So let me talk a little bit about this Dutch disease business. I've written on it extensively. So for clarification purposes, there is something called, or a phenomenon known as the natural resource curse. It's been written about extensively in various journals. I don't particularly like the word curse because it has a negative connotation, and it also strikes me as a permanent kind of situation. You know, a curse is something that has to be lifted by an act of God or something like that. So I have coined the term natural resource burden. It's more of a burden which can be lifted. Now, the natural resource burden, as it is, simply states that countries endowed with an abundance of resource tend to grow at a slower pace than their lesser endowed counterparts. And you look at countries like Nigeria, Chad, Equatorial Guinea versus countries like Singapore, Hong Kong, and so on and so forth. Now, one of the reasons cited for the natural resource burden is something called the Dutch disease. The Dutch disease is a situation that occurred in the Netherlands in the 1950s when the Netherlands discovered oil in the North Sea. And essentially what happened, all of the focus and attention went to the oil industry. And there was a movement of resources and monies and labor out of other above ground industries into the oil in search of more money, higher wages. This is a crowding, it's also known as the crowding out effect. When you have this kind of thing happening, the prices of labor, the prices of material, the prices of goods and services go up. It's simple supply and demand. Everybody's coming into the industry, pushes the price up. When your prices go up, it means that your locally produced goods and services become expensive, right? You have to hire people at a higher wage, materials are more, you're already seeing some of that. Prices for contractors have gone up, prices for materials and supplies. When those things happen, it makes your locally produced goods and services, it makes it very difficult for them to compete in the international market. And that's the Dutch disease. How do you avoid that? Well, You have to have some of the regulatory frameworks you're talking about. You need legislation. You need to, I don't like the word proper, but you need to support your other above ground industries. You also have to manage, you need a monetary policy that manage the influx of monies coming in. Because what happens is that your dollar gets stronger. As your dollar gets stronger, your goods and services gets more expensive. And then you know, and what happened in the Netherlands, it's that those industries, above ground industries, ultimately collapsed. So Guyana has to, as I said, you are seeing evidence of that Dutch disease. There's also another reason why the natural resource burden occurs, and this is my take on it. And that is, you see, growth and development, it's not just something on paper. There has to be an ecosystem that promotes growth and development. And as part of that ecosystem, you need professional training. You need things like professional development. You need a culture of development. So it's a whole bunch of different things that come together will create growth and development. It's not just simply having oil and bringing in the revenue. This idea that if we get oil and once we get the revenue, boom, Guyana is going to grow and transform, that's a misnomer. It doesn't quite happen that way. You need a lot more, because the only way that would happen is if you think Guyana has a money problem, if you define Guyana's problem as a money problem, then you think money would solve it. I would argue that Guyana's problem is much more than a money problem. It's a problem of a culture of development. It's a problem of corruption. It's a problem of lack of proper skills and training. It's all of those. It's that ecosystem that I think will contribute to growth and development. So identifying the Dutch disease as one of the impediments to growth and development is kind of not getting the whole picture.
Okay, but I want to go to a comment that just stopped short of speaking on. You said you're already seeing evidence
of the Dutch disease.
Here?
Yes.
Okay, just expound on that a bit for me.
So if you right now all focus is on oil and gas. Mm-hmm. You talk to young people in the street, workers, employees, that kind of thing. They want to get into oil and gas because oil and gas, the industry is paying higher wages. Mm-hmm. You're already seeing the cost of labor go up. Why? Because of the demand, supply and demand. You're already seeing the cost of materials go up. And this is exemplary of the Dutch disease. Why is it going up? It's going up because of supply and demand. There is a rush for higher wages that's being paid in the oil and gas industry. So you're already seeing evidence of that. Look at real estate prices. You try renting a property in Georgetown proper, and it's sky high. Now, at some point, the market will arbitrage and it'll level itself out. But right now, it's prices for most goods and services. Every time I come to Guyana, I say to my friends, Guyana is expensive. And it's sort of, you don't think about it, but as you leave and you go in your pocket and you look at your bill and you realize food stuff has gone up, materials and supplies, labor, all of those things have gone up significantly, and that's evidence of the Dutch disease.
Okay, thank you for that. So before we conclude, I wanted to ask you a bit about leadership. We've heard many individuals and we've seen international reports speaking about Guyana having a possible leadership crisis.
Yes.
And the fact that we're such a wealthy nation, but we still continue to talk about this failed dream about becoming the breadbasket of the Caribbean, or we're seeing countless instances of mismanagement of our resources. How crucial do you think leadership will play in the success or failure of oil and gas?
Oh, it's crucially important. It is my humble opinion that Guyana, with few exceptions, and I'm not going to name names, Guyana has had leaders, but we have not had leadership, with few exceptions. Now, let me sort of differentiate or sort of tee it up for you. A leader is someone that's elected, selected, nominated, appointed to a position of authority. And you have leaders all over the world, but they don't necessarily exercise leadership. Leadership, it's an activity. It's something you do. And you have people who have exercised leadership all over the world who have never held any appointed, selected position. And the two examples I like to use is Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. Neither of them was ever elected to anything, but they led a mass movement. Gandhi, not single-handedly, but with the support of the people, brought the British Empire to the table. Martin Luther King brought the American Empire, if you may, to the table with respect to civil rights. And none of those people were elected. What did they do? And this is what I talk about when I talk about leadership. Leadership is about engaging the people. Typically, leadership is required when problems and solutions to those problems are unclear. They're not defined. It's what we call adaptive problems, right? They're problems, so problems like economic development, unemployment, education, healthcare. These are problems that don't lend themselves to off-the-shelf solution. They're not technical problems. You can't go get a handbook and solve it. What is required is an adaptive process of leadership engaging the people. And this is what Gandhi and King were able to do. Gandhi was able to go to the Indians and says, listen, you've got the solution. You can take on the British Empire. You're a gazillion, there are a few. King did the same thing. If you simply refuse to cooperate with unjust law, you can take the power back. And so leadership is getting the individuals to own the solution and own the problem. Too often we look for leaders who we think have the answer in their pockets, and that's the kind of people we elect. Or we look for charismatic leaders, or a leader who speaks well. But that's not leadership. Leadership is engaging the people and bringing them along. So you have to go into the community, identify the problems and the challenges, and then give the people the tools. Get the people to recognize the challenges, and then give the people the tools to solve it. So what I mean by that, take unemployment. What a leader would do, a leader doesn't have a solution for unemployment, but what a leader could do, he can say, okay, or she can say, okay, is it lack of opportunities? Is it lack of skills? Is it lack of resources? Is it all of the above? We've got to do the analysis. And a leader engages the people. And once you identify the challenges or the causes, you can then say, okay, we as the government or the leader, we can create a lot of opportunities. You now have to equip yourself with the necessary training. So you see, it's a collaborative type of thing. It is engaging the people and bringing them along so that there is a collective approach to problem solving. And we haven't had that. And it's the same kind of thing we require in oil and gas. The example I give you at the top of the show is that you just go ask the average Guyanese, where do you situate yourself in the context of O&G in Guyana? He or she wouldn't know. That's leadership.
So you have not seen the type of leadership that's needed for the success of the oil and gas industry as yet?
It's too early to tell. I haven't seen it. We've had two governments to look at. One government has had 5 years at it. The other government has been in office a little under a year. So it's really not fair to assess their approach. But no, I haven't seen it. I really haven't seen. Not just with oil and gas, like I said, with few exceptions. Mm-hmm. I could name names, but I'm not going to. But with few exceptions, we have not had leadership of the type I'm talking about. And this is why we've had oil. We've had gold, we've had bauxite, we've had all. It hasn't worked. We've had money before. Money is not our problem. We've had all of those things, and it hasn't solved the problem because we have not had effective leadership.
Thank you. Mr. Haynes, your concluding thoughts on Guyana's future with oil, and where do you see the role for the diaspora to play?
I'll talk about the diaspora first, and then I'll talk about what I see the future is. Too often, Kiana, we jump to let's solve a problem. There's a problem, let's solve it, and we don't step back and do the analysis, right? What's the diaspora problem? What problem are we trying to solve? Have we defined it? So where I come from, you define the problem. Is it we want diaspora people to come home and invest? Is it we want to use diaspora talent to augment the talent we have in country? Is it we want diaspora to just send barrels and money and stuff? So unless you define that, Then once you've defined that, then you could begin to build an approach to engage the diaspora. And I think that has to happen. And I've shared this with Rosalinda, who's heading up the diaspora thing. So the role for the diaspora first has to be defined by whichever government is in office. And once it's defined, you have to then engage them in a constructive and a productive manner. Maybe it's all of those things that I said. If in fact you want diaspora to come home and invest, what are the incentives? How do you incentivize them? If you want to use their talent to augment your local talent here, how do you manage that organ transplant, if you may? You lifting people out of there, bringing them here, working side by side. So all of those things, diaspora does have a role. I maintain that Guyana cannot, and I've said this in previous shows, cannot move forward with half of its talent pool. And the way I got there is, about a good half of the country lives outside. And then in country, the half that's in country is divided along political and race lines. So you're really taking the field with a quarter of your talent pool. You can't get very far that way. It has to be all hands on deck. The current president, Dr. Ali, is talking about something called One Guyana. He hasn't rolled it out yet, but I'm hopeful. But it has to be all hands on deck. Guyana will not move forward with a fraction of its talent pool. You just can't.
So our success for oil, you're saying, without doubt, needs our diaspora talent.
It needs the diaspora talent. You have to engage your diaspora. You have to engage the diaspora. You need to provide the kind of leadership, the kind of community engagement and awareness. It is very crucial, Kiana, because, and you have to be honest with the people. You have to go to the people and say, the oil and gas industry cannot hire all of Guyana. It just wouldn't. Mm-hmm. Everybody thinks they're going to get a shot. It's misleading. Yes. And you have to be honest enough to say, it's not going to solve Guyana's problems. And this is a challenge, a test of leadership. You have to go to the people and be honest. It's not going to solve all of our problems, and it's not going to hire all Guyanese. It's sort of like that book you read in school, A House for Mr. Biswas, where Biswas thinks if he gets the house, it's going to solve all of his problems. And then he gets the house and it blows away. And well, same thing, oil for Guyana. And we think oil will solve all of our problems. So going forward, I think there has to be some honesty, some transparency and accountability. I think some of that is happening. But more importantly, the community outreach, the training, the awareness. So Guyanese understand clearly how they fit. Where do they fit in terms of oil and gas? And then they can decide to get themselves equipped, ready, certified, trained, whatever they need to do so that they can participate effectively. That requires leadership. Unless that happens, we'll have new buildings, a couple of new roads and those types of things. But the history will be Equatorial Guinea, Chad, Angola, Venezuela. You can call out countries who all have oil and gas. It hasn't solved their problem. The vast majority of some of the people in those countries live in abject poverty. And we could go down that road if we're not careful.
If there's no leadership. Got you. And you were supposed to give me your thoughts on Guyana's future with oil and gas.
Well, it could be good, right? It could be good if managed well. I don't subscribe to the idea that we got a terribly bad deal and it's the end of the world. Of course it's a bad deal. I've looked at it. Other countries have gotten better deals. I always caution about these simplistic analysis, by the way, but leave that aside. Let's assume it's a bad deal. It's not the end of the world. There's going to be other deals, and we have a chance to correct it going forward. So our future can be bright, but the industry has to be managed well, and it requires a certain level of transparency, accountability, and honesty. At the end of the day, it comes back to leadership, right? Yeah. If you don't have that kind of leadership, like I said, you will see a couple of nice buildings going up and maybe a few new roads, but that's not change. It's not transformation. You need to improve your healthcare system, your educational systems, all those types of things. Economic opportunities for everybody, all Guyanese. So I'm hopeful, but it's too soon to tell. It's really too soon to tell. Are we on the right track? I don't know. I don't live here, but seems like we're doing some things right. We're getting some things right. But a comprehensive analysis needs to be done. And the people have to demand all of the things I'm talking about. You know, I'm a big believer in individual responsibility. And this is where leaders have to go to the people and tell them, you have to be responsible. We will give you the tools. We'll create the enabling environment. But at the end of the day, you have to own the problem and own the solution, right? And we will give you the tools. We'll create the enabling environment. We'll provide the necessary training, whatever it is, right? But the people have to be vigilant, and they have to hold the leaders, whoever the leaders are, accountable. Because, of course, we elected them. They represent us. And we have to hold them accountable. And politicizing everything and, cuss down here, and that's just terribly meaningless. You have to be vigilant. And when you're going to take on whomever it is, whether it's the government or anyone else, you have to do your homework. You have to be evidence-based. You have to have the evidence and the facts on your side. Don't just take on something to be political. I find, and I'll part with this, I find too many of these shows in Guyana are political, and it's terribly boring for someone like me. So what I mean by that, you bring on someone from the opposition, and they tell you all the great things they've done. Then you bring on someone from the government, and they tell you all the great things the government's doing. Well, if everybody is doing great things, why isn't Guyana better off? Right? So how do you bridge that gap? And this is why bringing politicians on, what do you think they're going to do? They're going to tell you how great they've been and or are, And that's not terribly helpful. I think we have to be more engaged, and shore base, the gas to shore rather, sovereign wealth fund, all of these things, we have to do the proper analysis. And perhaps we can have public forums where we present the analysis, as opposed to having a 1-hour show with experts. We have experts in Guyana. Everybody's an expert. Everybody's an expert in everything. Oh, why you think that's so? Have you read it? Nope, no, it just sounds like a bad idea. It's sort of knee-jerk. And I find that terribly, terribly unhelpful. And if that becomes our modus operandi, if that becomes our manner of confronting the government, the opposition, whomever, we're not going to get very far. Because you'll do your thing, your spin, they'll spin back, and we'll continue to languish.
Mr. Haynes, thank you very much for your perspectives, certainly enlightening. And I do hope we can have you back on the radio show to answer some more questions, perhaps next time from our viewers. And to our listeners on Facebook Live, our radio listeners as well, thank you very much for joining us on Governance, Corruption, and Justice. Mr. Haynes, once again, thank you for making the time. I know you have to get back to the U.S. very soon.
Yes.
So we wish you a safe trip in advance. So ladies and gentlemen, have a good night. And remember, please practice social distancing, wear your mask, and if you haven't already, please get vaccinated. Good night.
Thanks, Kiana. Thanks for having me.